To a wide open Tobias Harris, and Tobias drills it! Sixers up one!
Embiid fakes, Embiid down the lane!
What is going on, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Pick Swap Podcast, the first official playoff edition of the podcast as the Sixers started their run, secured their fate by taking down the Miami Heat. With me today, I got Matt Chirico to break down the Sixers versus Knicks matchup over from Mo Sports Network, starting to break down this matchup a little bit more of a Knicks perspective. So excited to dive into the matchup. And Matt, I am disappointed that this time next week, we're going to have to be talking about how the Sixers defeated the Knicks in 6 games.
Hey man, listen, it's going to be, I know, very physical. It's going to be intense. And I mean, anytime we faced you guys, it's been playoff intensity, right? It's
Yeah.
been very high stakes kind of feel to it, even though it was regular season games. Now, of course, there's a lot more on the line. Coming off of that game last night in which you guys, didn't look your best, but the guys stepped up when you needed it to. And sometimes it's better to be lucky than good in a sense. And, Nick Batum had some luck last night. Joel Embiid, not so much, but got lucky by his teammates stepping up. And hey, I'm in for a good series regardless. Obviously, I think the Knicks come out on top, but we're going to have to share both of our perspectives and both of our reasoning as to how we get from point A to point B on these conclusions. So, fill me in a little bit. Last night, obviously, game against the Miami Heat, a team that's known to play some junkyard dogs, especially on the defensive side. Jimmy Butler, he came out looking like playoff Jimmy, had that injury in the first half to, slow things down a little bit, and the Miami Heat eventually cooled down. What was the ultimate goal aside from Jimmy's injury to you guys coming out on top last night?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a bizarre game last night. That for starters, it felt like there was the focus right out of the gates from the Sixers. Jumped out to a 9-2 lead. Kyle Lowry was everywhere to start that one. And then all of a sudden, the Heat dropped into a zone, and it wasn't even a traditional zone as it typically never is with Miami. Essentially, it was more or less a box and one on Joel Embiid that they were constantly having the back pressure. I will give a little tip of the hat for Kevin Love for constantly just putting a hand in his back. And the Sixers specifically, I thought, really fumbled by trying to continually play through Joel Embiid. That it was a conscious effort. Miami wanted to take him away, and the Sixers, rather than just playing normal basketball and just, winning in other ways, it felt like everything got stuck on trying to play through Joel, which I get it. And even like the general sense of his own, a lot of times the way to break it is by having that guy duck to the top of the free throw or right at the free throw line and then find a 3-point shot from there. Felt like things got too stagnant. Overall, they did figure it out, and Nico Batum was the key to unlocking that. A lot of movements, the quick decisions, the three-pointers opened everything up. But it was a night and day difference between the first and second half. And before I kind of dive into where I think things turned, I do want to ask, what was your rooting interest in that game? Who did you want to come out top and face the Knicks in this first round?
It's actually hysterical that you bring up that zone defense because I was texting a couple of my buddies last night, and we're friends specifically because of Nick's Twitter. Right now, these are a couple kids that I met back in the dark days, man. I'm telling you, 2015, 2016 days of New York Knicks basketball, where we had to watch Jarrett Jack, Alonzo Trier, and co run the point guard for our team. So these are some friends that we've been through thick and thin together when it comes to New York basketball. And so last night we watched that same zone defense and by the Miami Heat, and we said to ourselves, man, if this ends up being the team that we're facing, I feel really comfortable about our perimeter shooting. Hartenstein stretching the floor and pulling these guys out a little bit, and then being able to rock out with OG Anunoby, Dante DiVincenzo, Bojan Bogdanovic, who are all 40+% three on their respective sides of the floor. So I really was kind of licking my lips at that. And I was less and less afraid of the Heat as the game went on. Of course, there's that factor of Miami plays super gritty. And quite frankly, they tend to come out and somebody gets injured. Whenever we play the Heat, somebody hurts themselves. Last year, Randall hurt his ankle in the playoffs, quickly got ran over. I mean, Jalen Brunson hurt himself over Bam Adebayo. So you see how Bam plays that brand of basketball that's somewhat just reckless and kind of uncertain, right? And that's really where it comes in, that unpredictability factor. So I didn't like the Miami Heat as a matchup just because of that reason. And obviously, there's that Miami Heat always step up in the playoffs kind of attitude to it.
Heat
So
culture.
I was rooting for you guys. And partially, yeah, that Heat culture, exactly. So I was rooting for you guys just because I'm sorry, but I do think it's the easier of the two matchups if Joel Embiid is not 100%. Like we saw last night, I think that's a huge part. And I feel like a lot of people woke up somewhat forgetting that the way Embiid looked last night, I would say it wasn't even 70% of himself. You saw when he got the ball in his hands, he wasn't comfortable backing anybody down in the post. He was settling for a lot more jump shots than we're typically used to. And that just, he didn't look comfortable on the offensive side of the floor. So
Yeah.
I wanted to hear, I was rooting for you guys, but I want to hear how you kind of came out of this with the perspective on Embiid.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. Obviously, Joel Embiid's health and status and just the level he's playing at is really ultimately decides the ceiling of the Sixers team. I think I'm a little bit more optimistic than most on that. He definitely had a really bad first half specifically, but I think my biggest takeaway is he didn't look injured to me. To me, it looked like he was number one, clearly out of shape, that he's definitely playing himself back into basketball shape. And number two, it just feels like he doesn't quite trust the knee yet. That a lot of those in the first half
Right.
specifically, like those bunnies around the rim that he missed several of, those are baskets that typically Joel Embiid's dunking. And it felt to me that it's like he just doesn't have like the trust in it yet. And while that's not great for sure, that's something that can be fixed. I would rather that be the case than me thinking it's actually the injury holding him back. So I think I'm a little bit more
Mhm.
optimistic on most. And then for Joel specifically, like for starters, I thought his decision making was actually overall good last night. And the second half specifically is where he shined down the stretch, having 11 of his 23 points in the fourth quarter, that big time 3-pointer, that big time and one after the offensive rebound. And then the pass to Kelly Oubre to really seal the deal in last night's game. That was like such a significant step in his growth, I feel, because we've seen Joel in past years kind of go down with the ship by himself, where he's forcing himself into a bad shot, going through double and triple teams, when sometimes the right decision is just to trust your teammates. So, number one, shout out Kelly Oubre for being in the right spot, making himself available. And I do think like it's a tangible step for Joel to make that proper decision and trust. So I think I'm more optimistic than most, but it certainly was far from the perfect version of him last night.
Right. And I think just having Joel Embiid on the floor obviously pulls so much gravity
Yeah.
to him that if he can just make those decisive passes like we saw in the second half last night, that's going to give the Knicks a lot of trouble. Just being hit on the floor as the offensive presence he is going to attract more attention than if it was just Tyrese Maxey, obviously, out there. Now, I want to ask you, I've had a lot of people and Charles Barkley included, talking about how Tobias Harris is an X factor this series. Tobias Harris is somebody that yourself, myself, Nick, we've talked about how this guy is just on milk cartons this season. Is there any chance we see an upgraded version of playoff Tobias this series?
Well, it's going to be interesting. For starters, I thought like the biggest testament to Nick Nurse last night is like benching Tobias Harris in crunch time, and he was not in the closing lineup for the first time all year that was the case. And I've
Right.
kind of spoken that about this throughout the year that like I was never been as hard on Nick Nurse for not doing it until this point, because here's where we judge him: is these are when the decisions truly matter. And for Tobias specifically, like the goal is always to get him to be playing his best basketball at this very moment. So I don't think the route to doing that was messing with his head and benching him earlier on. But there's no doubt that like when you just break down the top five on this roster, or the top three that fit around Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey, Tobias Harris just doesn't quite crack that list. So I still think he's going to be in the starting
Right.
lineup from a game by game basis. I still think there will be games where he has his time to shine. And to be perfectly honest, like he had that one low light where he missed like 3 straight layups, got the put back and could not hit any of them. But like in the general
But
sense,
people are going to harp on that.
for sure. And in the general sense, like I did not think yesterday was one of his worst games, specifically this year in a Sixers uniform. I thought his decision making overall was fine,
Right.
but I was really excited to see Nick Nurse make that decision. And there's no doubt that when just speaking about like a skill set standpoint, both Kelly Oubre and Nico Batum are just like more of what you want out of the guy in that position. So I think that Tobias being out of the closing lineups is going to be more or less the theme from here on out.
Now you brought him up, the guy that saved the day last night, Nick Batum.
Yes, sir.
Let me ask: is this somebody that you can rely on in this series to give you 15 points per game? Because 20 last night seemed like a bit much to me, right? Like he had
Yeah.
that one putback was pretty crazy. I don't know
Yeah.
how many of those we're going to see. And I don't know how often he's going to give you that type of 3-point percentage. But Nick Batum is somebody that I feel is just he's a certified hooper. You know, this guy's been around the league for years. He knows how to win games. He's been around winning teams. And, you know, being that he was with the Clippers earlier this season and not getting the burn that people really like him to get, and he got a bad rap for it. He comes over and now he's a different player. He's kind of evolving into his role with the Sixers. And last night he stepped up when you needed it most. So is Nick Batum a guy that you guys can look at and kind of turn to this series as, hey, we might need your help to step up here in the absence of Tobias and in the absence of Joel's injury?
So I'm not going to say that he's going to be shooting 6 for 10 from three on a night by night basis. I think that might have been a once in a lifetime or once in a season opportunity. But I do think that this is going to be a guy that impacts winning for the Sixers team in a major way. And defensively, he was just as important as he was on the offensive end last night. That block on Hero towards the end
Right.
was huge. He dealt with Jimmy Butler for a large portion of yesterday's game. He's just like an adult high IQ basketball player. And he's been so refreshing as an entry passer to Joel throughout the season. That's been like one of the bizarre skill sets that the Sixers have just struggled to find players that are adequate or good at. And Batum is excellent at just making the on the money pass to Joel Embiid in the post. And frankly, like when we talk about like the matchup standpoint, I think the Heat, to be honest, were a good warm-up matchup for this or for this Knicks team. That the Heat are hard-nosed, they're scrappy, they're defensive-minded, and a lot of those characteristics apply to the Knicks as well. Now, granted, there's no Jalen Brunson on that Miami Heat team, and that's certainly where my biggest fear is, and I think everyone there. But I do think like they saw some looks, and I don't expect the Knicks to drop into a freaky zone the way that they saw last night. But I think from a mentality standpoint,
Right.
this was a good stepping stone matchup for the Sixers team. So I do think Batum's going to be a guy logging 25, 35, even up to 35 minutes a game throughout this playoff run. He's just like a guy that's like plays within his role, is confident within himself, and can step up. So I think he caught fire last night with those 3-pointers, but he is important to this team, and I do think that sticks throughout.
Yeah, I mean, 35 years old, not exactly what you'd expect out of that guy, out of everybody on the roster. I thought for sure if there was going to be a difference maker in the game last night, to me, I was going to take Buddy Hield. And he started off, you know, when he came into the game, it looked like the threes that he was hitting, and he was a few feet behind the arc on a couple of them. I was like, all right, this is the time when Buddy steps up, and this is when the Sixers have needed him to. He finished with an underwhelming 7 points on 3 of 8 shooting, 1 of 5 from deep. What is there to be desired in Buddy Hield come this series? Because he's going to have a tough matchup against some defensive guards like DiVincenzo, Josh Hart, Deuce McBride. So, what do you expect from him in this series against New York?
Yeah, he didn't shine in the stat sheet last night, but I was happy with Buddy Hield last night. That I thought he competed defensively and was better defensively than we've seen from him really throughout his career. That was the first playoff game, and even though it wasn't a technical playoff game, first play-in opportunity of his career. Of course, he's been with Sacramento and
Right.
Indiana and missed out on that. So I think he was hungry for the moment. I do think there was that little spurt where I think he had 6 assists last night too, which is like his ability to create
Did. Yep.
dribble penetration, then kick. Like that's something that I don't think he gets a lot of credit for. And we've seen it in small doses with the Sixers team. He really opened up that zone last night. So I was pretty happy with Buddy Hield. His shooting gravity is what creates everything in his game. And of course, just 1 for 5 last night. But we know who he is throughout his career. And he is a guy capable of catching fire, which is so valuable around the Sixers team. I know Joel got in his grill a little bit about making sure he shoots it because he passed up a couple looks early on. That's the worst version of
Right.
Buddy Hield, when he's not being decisive enough or not letting it rip. We know how good you are as a shooter. I want to see it, man. That I don't care if you're getting closed out on. You're that good that just let it fly. So I was happy that he kind of leaned on that down the stretch, and I do think he provided a positive spark. But one of my difference makers for this Sixers team compared to last year's is each of these guys has the ability to change the game. The Buddy Hields, the Kelly Oubres, the Nico Batums, the Kyle Lowrys. These are all guys that just bring it at a level that when you look at the past year's bench units, that they just didn't have. So that's one of the driving forces why I'm specifically optimistic about this team. I'm curious if any of those guys strike fear into your heart from the Knicks perspective.
I definitely think that that is something that kind of intimidates me more than what the Miami Heat had going on, right? The
Yeah.
Miami Heat, you know what you're getting from them in terms of Jimmy Butler. He's going to be there night in and night out, hustling. it really comes down to who on the Miami Heat is going to hit a timely three-pointer tonight. Right? Like, is it going to be Kevin Love? Is it going to be Caleb Martin? Is it going to be, Tyler Hero? Is it going to be Haywood Highsmith? You just didn't know who you were going to get from the Miami Heat, but you knew that it wasn't going to be a guy going off for 30 points. One thing is Kelly Oubre, Nick Batum last night can give you 20, 25 points at any given moment. Buddy Hield, especially with his three-point prowess, like you were saying, he gets hot. That's a game-changing type of factor right there. So I
Yeah.
think there are going to be guys. It's not just a matter of, hey, come in and stop Maxey, stop Embiid, and the Knicks win the series. I think it is going to be that kind of grit and grind type of mentality. And I just feel like the Knicks are in a good position to defend that. Just being that we have OG Anunoby, we've talked about, me and you, how big of a factor this guy is. And it's just really a breath of fresh air as a Knicks fan to have a guy that can guard the 1 through 5. And not only can he guard them, but he's going to be getting a couple steals. He's going to give you a couple fast break buckets just coming off of that defensive matchup. And he's going to be giving that guy hell for an entire 4 quarters of that game. So I do think that he guards Joel Embiid. I think they're going to have that
Wow.
matchup on him. And I think Hartenstein is going to find himself. Yeah, I think that's the type of mentality Tibbs is going to come into this with, to where, listen, I wouldn't be surprised to see some double teams thrown at Embiid by any means, especially if he is looking to post up. But I do think it's going to be OG Anunoby. And I think the confidence that Tibbs has and that he's expressed in Anunoby's defense is going to be what kind of makes or breaks this series in a sense. Because listen, no Mitchell Robinson within the starting lineup. You got to find a way to get that defense within that first 5, right? Like, Mitch is going to come in and he's going to give you rim protection, but that's not something that Hartenstein's providing within that first few minutes of the game. And I think having OG he's an able body. Of course, his wingspan is insane. So I think his perimeter defense is really going to stand out here. And him sticking to Embiid is really what's going to be a key factor for the Knicks if they want to win this series.
That's interesting. And let me dig in on this Knicks team a little bit here. So I want to start with, I respect this Knicks team a ton. That, like, when looking at how the bracket shook out, that I wanted the Milwaukee Bucks. I wanted this to be a Sixers versus Bucks first round matchup. And if that had come to fruition, I would be pounding the table up here saying Sixers in 5 at the worst. And I think that's the team that's leaking oil, going downhill, the Doc Rivers effect, all these variables. I don't feel that way about the Knicks. That I do believe this is a legitimately good basketball team. This is going to take a gritty, tough series. They're going to bring it. They're never going to roll over. But I still feel more confident that this Sixers team in 7 games, I'm more confident that this Sixers team in 7 games can beat this Knicks team than I did in a 1-game setting against Miami. And the reason that I say this is Jalen Brunson's terrific, but that's like the only primary creator that you guys have on the offensive end. And I think Nick Nurse is going to scheme it so the ball is coming out of his hands. I expect Lowry to be the pest that's all over him, and I think they're going to be throwing doubles to force other guys. Now, guys like Dante DiVincenzo, Josh Hart, OG Anunoby, they're awesome, but none of them are like, go get a bucket myself guys. It's very much like Brunson's the creator, and I think that's going to be the chess match that we see out of Nurse, that he's just simply not going to let Brunson get to his spots. And my biggest concern is, I think, like, Joel Embiid loves to play drop coverage. Brunson's going to murder him if that is the case, that he's just going to kill him on the mid-range. But I think, once again, that they're going to be throwing blitzes at Brunson. They're just not going to let that guy beat them. And I don't know if the Knicks have enough guys other than him that can.
One thing that's really stood out to me, to elaborate on that point, is that people have came to me talking about this Knicks team is better without Julius Randle. And now that's something I just haven't been able to get behind, because when you have an all NBA caliber guy who is out for the season, averaging 25 points, 10 rebounds, 5 assists, you want him on the floor like, come on. When Jalen Brunson comes off of the floor, just like you're saying, there aren't many guys on this Knicks team that are creating offense for themselves.
Right.
And one thing that Dante's been able to do is get his game off of the dribble, which has been really, really impressive. And honestly, that's why a lot of people had him in most improved player talks. Is just because Dante, somebody who we've known from his Golden State days, Sacramento days, Milwaukee days, as, hey, he's going to get the three and he's going to shoot it. Yeah, even back to the Nova days, he's just a shooter. He's just a straight shooter. And then all of a sudden, we're seeing this bag out of him that we really haven't. And I feel like that's very interesting, and it's going to be a key to the game for both him, for Josh Hart, Deuce McBride. I mean, up and down the Knicks roster, everyone's going to have to step up in their own way offensively to support Jalen Brunson. Now, you mentioned Kyle Lowry. I'm sorry, but I just don't like. I totally think Kyle Lowry can be an annoying defender.
Yeah.
I think Jalen Brunson is just too high caliber of a player to be annoyed by an aging Kyle Lowry. Now, I do think you'll find where Lowry gets himself in the lane and he draws a nice charge here or there, but I can't imagine a scenario where Jalen Brunson is shut down because of Lowry. And I just
No.
think that he's just a step quicker. He's just a step too fast. And I think it comes down to, can you contain Brunson? There's not going to be any stopping him. That's the one thing that we've come to learn. And I've been afraid of it because, I've watched this guy evolve from a role player to a superstar, not a role player when he came over, but nobody touted him as a top 10 player. I'm going to go ahead and say 5 this season, the way that he's been playing. So seeing him grow in front of our eyes, and I'm not sure if you saw the quote from the Knicks brass, their front office put out, it was last summer. They said that the Knicks anticipate the version of Jalen Brunson they'd be getting in 2024 is the one that played in that series against the Miami Heat, that gave them 41 points, 38 points, 36 points, back to back to back games. And I feel that same type of player is going to stand out in this game as well. I mean, we saw Jimmy Butler one-on-one last season, couldn't do too much. He found ways to get his. I think a really interesting stat is Jalen Brunson is the only guy within the top 4 leading scorers to not be top 10 in free throws per game. He's playing, as Twitter likes to call it, ethical hoops. It's not getting to the line and just hitting free throws. Not that, other guys are seeing success without doing that, but it's just Brunson is doing these things at a whole nother level that I don't know if the Sixers have anybody that can stop that right now.
Yeah, I'll start with, you're not going to catch me saying bad words about Jalen Brunson. That I love the dude. He's one of my favorite just pure basketball players to watch, and the Sixers will not be shutting him down by any means. But my point about Kyle Lowry here, he's not going to be stopping the guy, but what I do guarantee you is there will be several moments in this series where Jalen Brunson feels entirely like, get this dude away from me. That it's going to be Lowry.
Frustrated.
Yeah, it's going to be Lowry all over him, bugging him. There were moments like even last night specifically, there was a play where Lowry just dead sprint from the offensive end all the way down to the defensive end, just get right in Jimmy Butler's grill. It's going to be that kind of stuff. Him flailing, getting on inbounds, forcing an offensive foul here and there. That's the stuff that I do think wears on a guy through the length of a 7-game series. And like for Kyle Lowry, he's a primetime one of those guys where you absolutely hate to play against and absolutely love when he's on the team. And I think like that amount of look is going to be good. I also think that there's going to be a ton of Kelly Oubre on Jalen Brunson. And I know that Brunson's a guy that like is super crafty, still going to get his in every matchup. But Oubre's been really successful this season guarding smaller guards, that he does have a 7-foot wingspan. He competes defensively. He's much at his best when he's kind of like swallowing up the guy in front of him. Trae Young's a guy that he did a terrific job on. And I get that, like, obviously not the same exact skill set here, but I do think like the strategy behind how you guard kind of translates here. So I expect that to be the case. And one of my arguments that I do want to hear your opinion on here is, again, I'm a Brunson guy. I think he's a top 10 NBA player, but Joel Embiid still for sure better. And the gap between Joel Embiid and Jalen Brunson, I still give once again the edge to Joel Embiid. But then the gap between Jalen Brunson and Tyrese Maxey, I think is way smaller than the gap between Tyrese Maxey and whoever you want to argue is the second best player in the Knicks. I would say OG Anunoby, but I can hear you out on Dante DiVincenzo, or if you want to make the case for it's probably between DiVincenzo and OG. OG would be my pick there because obviously Randall out of the fold. But I do think that when we're talking about just top end talent of this team, that gap is more notable than a lot of people are giving credit.
I think, man, it's really tough because I also, I've always been able to come on here and Jalen Brunson's never caught the strays that, anybody else has been giving him in other fan bases.
Yeah,
Other
I
people
love
love
him.
to come on and they love to discredit Brunson. And it's almost like they did something to his team. But I think the Knicks, they get a bad rap in the media regardless. But man, it's tough. The second best player definitely in my eyes is OG Anunoby on this Knicks team. It's just, do I think that Maxey, man, I don't know, because last night what I saw from Maxey, yes,
Bad
he was
game.
solid, but it was not impactful the way that OG can impact a game while also not putting up statistics, if that makes sense. I know even if OG is giving me 6 points, 2 rebounds, 1 assist, I know OG gave me intangibles off the paper that led to winning basketball. When Tyrese Maxey isn't in his bag on the offensive side, can you rely on him to elevate the Sixers in a way necessary to get you guys victories?
I see. My initial starter here is I think last night was a bad game for Tyrese Maxey. That it wasn't just okay. That
Mhm.
was pretty close to the most fearful and worst that I've seen him play in a Sixers uniform straight up, specifically this year. That I don't expect that to be the case moving forward. I think he was impacted by the heat zone and had struggles with the looks. And one thing that I want to give Maxey credit on that I expect to be tested in this series is he's improved miles defensively. That I think that there's going to be moments
Mm,
where Thibs is going to have him circled and say, we're seeing if that guy can play himself on the court or off it. That we're going to take him at him possession after possession and see if he can hold up. And I think he will. That I do think that he's improved to a plus defender at this point, which is pretty crazy to say considering kind of the baseline when he did come into this. And my other counter here is Jalen Brunson, again, terrific. Who does he match up with? Is Maxey the matchup there?
defensively,
Yeah.
if we are on defense,
Yeah.
man, I don't. I'd imagine he's going to be with Lowry just because, listen, Brunson's going to have to do so much on the offensive side of things. It's
Yeah.
almost like, look, we're going to give you somewhat of a break with Kyle Lowry because Kyle Lowry's not a guy that's going to turn on the burners and run right past you. So I think DiVincenzo or Josh Hart are going to be the ones to guard
Okay.
Tyrese Maxey. But obviously that leaves Tobias Harris. That leaves Kelly Oubre too. We're lucky enough to be deep at the wing position to where I don't think our length is going to be entirely a problem. But I feel like there is one thing to this Knicks team that we haven't brought up is that the 76ers have not scored 100 points against this Knicks team this year. Does that worry you? Does the Knicks defense worry you by any means? A team with OG on the floor that was top 4 in both offensive and defensive net rating. That's why they're a top 4 seed.
Yeah, I think this is going to be some 80s basketball scores that we're going to be seeing in this series. That I think in both directions, it's going to
Facts.
be. Yeah, I think we're going to see some 90 to 87 type wins in this type of matchup. And you know what? I think both teams can win that way, so I'm okay with it. I will note that in those 4 matchups against the Knicks, 3 of them without Joel Embiid, and 1 of him with him not being 100%. So I don't dive as much into these stats as I think a lot of people are throwing out there. And that's still the question mark: is how are the Knicks going to guard Joel Embiid? I know you said that OG is going to be the guy, and I will note that teams have had success when doing that. Drew Holiday has done a very successful job, and again, is a guy significantly smaller than Joel, but he's just a pest. And OG is a guy that is a very good defender. I'm not slighting him on this, but I still think Joel, if you leave that in one-on-one, it's going to be a problem. And if you have a floater, the way that I think they probably will with Hartenstein behind him or Mitchell Robinson behind him, then you're playing with the devil by the
Right.
amount of 3-point shooters that the Sixers team does have. That's where Buddy Hield is truly the X factor on this team. That when you run around him, Tobias Harris, Buddy Hield, Nico Batum, and Tyrese Maxey there, you can't really leave any of those guys open. So if that's the plan to have OG as the front man and Hartenstein as kind of the roamer behind, I think there's too many dangerous shooters on this Sixers team.
Is there any feeling of uncertainty for playoff Embiid? I know he's got the rap of, hey, when the postseason comes around, when April comes, he's not the one to rise to the occasion. Between that and the health lingering, is there any little bit of doubt in the back of your mind that, hey, man, there's a chance we don't see the best version of Joel just because of both the injury and he's just have the reputation to not rise to the occasion?
Yeah, so the reputation thing, it's the bar is set so high for that dude that we're talking about like his regression in playoffs goes from him being an MVP caliber player to him just being an all-star caliber player. And to throw this right back in the Knicks face right here, to compare it to a guy like Julius Randle goes from an all-star caliber
Julius
player
Randle, absolutely.
to a guy that straight up loses you games when he plays bad. Joel, while he's had his stinkers for sure,
Yep.
he still is like plays impactful ball to winning. That even like those bad games where he shot poorly, there's been like defensive moments where he's kept his team afloat. And that two-way kind of impact, I still believe in. And I think that he's really taken a stride forward in his processing of the game, his ability to read defenses this season, career high in assists per game at over 5.4, I believe is what he ended at. That's all stuff that I do think equates to translating the postseason. And once again, I think that the supporting cast is able to step up in a way that's warranted his trust. So I think it's a worse reputation than he does deserve. Like a night like last night, like 23, 15, and 5. That's not a good statistical game for him. And frankly, he did not play that well. But on the scheme of just like the scale of just a general NBA player, it's a damn good basketball game. So I think it's a worse reputation than he does deserve. And I do think that him more so than anybody is itching to break that narrative. So I think that this is the year that he does do that.
Can I ask you, what percentage do you think Joel Embiid is playing at?
So again, I don't think it's an injury thing. I think it's more the trust in the knee and the fitness. But to give a straight up percentage, probably 70. That I think like that's going to improve throughout. Like again, I think he was just tired last night. You could see it wearing on him, and the substitution patterns were off. When you think about hit in general, the way Joel plays and what was the case for most of the season, he plays the entirety of the first quarter, then he rests for the first couple minutes of the second, closes out halftime, plays either close to or the entirety of the third quarter. Sometimes he would get taken out around that 10-minute mark and then come in with like 8 minutes left in the fourth and then closes out from there. When he looked at it last night, there was a whole lot more of Nick Nurse taking him off and putting him back on, that he would come off for a quick 2 minutes and then thrown back in. So it was not this steady long-term play. That to me is purely a fitness indication that I think his movement was fine. He's definitely not like the healthiest version of him, but I think this is way more about him balancing that fitness and just getting back into game speed. Again, missing those little lanes around the rim. If that's a normal Joel Embiid, he's just going up and slamming that. So I think the more the playoffs progress, he's going to get closer to that 100% like way sooner than I think a lot of people are expecting. But I'm not as concerned on the injury standpoint as people definitely are.
Okay. Honestly, I haven't. I've caught up with everything that Embiid has had, but I wouldn't know that same Sixers perspective as to how the lead up to this kind of injury has unfolded. One thing that I also wanted to say is that if you are a basketball fan to any capacity, you just gotta love the Tibbs versus Nick Nurse matchup beyond the players here. Right?
Yeah.
Like these are two guys, defensive minded coaches, old school grit and grind. They're going to make you work. You had mentioned these are going to be some low scoring 80s style basketball games. And those are two guys that can't get enough of it, right? Like
Yeah.
these are both coaches that love and live for that type of basketball. So, quite frankly, I think this is going to be the best matchup in the East out of the first round. I think the Milwaukee series is a dud. I mean,
Mhm.
I like you said, they're just a dumpster fire waiting to happen. The Orlando and Cleveland series, those are
Ugh.
two solid teams. But listen, is anybody expecting them, either of those teams, to be serious? And then Boston is just going to walk over whoever they have to face in that first round, if it's Chicago or if it's Miami without Jimmy.
Yeah.
This is definitely going to be the best series until we get to the Eastern Conference Finals. So let me ask you this. If the Sixers do come out on top in this series, are you looking at that Pacers team, because that's who you're anticipating coming out? You looking at them and like kind of licking your lips a little bit over that matchup?
Yeah, I think whichever one of these teams wins, the Knicks or Sixers definitely clear the winner of that Bucks and Pacers team. And it's kind of disappointing as a whole the way the bracket has shaken out. Is even a matchup like last night, and obviously the story has changed now that Jimmy's hurt. But I think both Miami and Philadelphia are teams within the top four, and the other two teams being the Knicks and Celtics there for having a chance to go deep. So the bracket definitely did not shake off and adequately represent the teams that I think are legitimately good this year. But I do think that whoever wins this matchup between the Knicks and the Sixers, and again, I do think it will be the Sixers, will clear that Bucks and Pacers winner for sure.
All right. So listen, we've talked about it. We've talked about the ins and outs. Now I
Hit me.
need to hear how many games it's going to go, who the series MVP is going to be, and why.
All right. I'm hitting you right on the money. It's Sixers and 6 right here. And I do think this is going to be hard fought. This is going to be gritty games. I do think that the series MVP is probably going to be Nick Nurse here. And I know that's a little outside the
Hmm,
box, but that's my like
I
biggest
like it.
driving reason why I do think this Sixers team is different this year. That for the first time in the entirety of the Joel Embiid era, they have a coaching advantage on a nightly basis. And Thibodeau is great for sure, but I will take Nick Nurse going to bat, getting in the lab, scheming up different defenses. And I do think that he's going to find ways to just interrupt the flow of Jalen Brunson that like
Mhm.
teams have not figured out this season. That it's going to be blitzes, it's going to be different looks at him, and I think that they're going to able to stump that Knicks offense enough. And then on the other side, I do think Joel Embiid ultimately rises up and has a little bit of a signature playoff series that I think from the pure statistical standpoint, it's not going to be him having these 70 and 50-point games the way he has during the regular season, but he is going to dominate on both sides, set the tone defensively, show his ability as a playmaker, which he hasn't really done at the playoff stage yet. So I think that Joel Embiid does prove a lot of people wrong. And I think Nick Nurse is going to be the guy leading the charge for this team.
I am a big Nick Nurse guy. I've loved Nick Nurse, even in his Toronto stint. I thought he was kind of a scapegoat when they were,
For
clearing
sure.
house over there. I love his brand of basketball, and that leads me into this about Tibbs too. You had mentioned Tom Thibodeau as a guy that we love his grit and grind. I have to commend Tibbs just because, listen, before the season started, I said I don't think this Knicks team can have championship aspirations with Thibodeau as the head coach. He came into this season not only has his rotations, his adjustments, his ability to get the most out of guys like Deuce McBride, Precious Achua. I mean, even adding Dante into the starting lineup, he's just been pulling all the right strings so far this season. So I have to commend him just because everybody's known Tibbs as this guy that he's going to run your starters into the floor and your superstars into the ground, and then that's all you're going to get. They're going to be burnt by the end of the first round, and that's all that happens. This year just feels like Tom Thibodeau, it's an old dog that learned new tricks. It's blown my mind, quite frankly, because I haven't seen a coach make these types of adjustments, at least a Knicks head coach, in a long, long time. So I'm going to go ahead and say I do have the Knicks in 5. I'm sorry.
Wow.
I think it
Wow.
is. I think it is going to be 5. I quite frankly do not trust Joel Embiid's knee. I know you said it was a trust thing, and I think that's going to kind of play a big factor here. Whether it does hurt him or ache, or it is all in his head, that's unknown. But I do think that this 76ers team, it reminds me of that same Cavaliers team that we had played in the first round last year, just in the sense that there's a few different sharpshooters that could beat you. There's some depth in some places, lacking in others. But I think ultimately the grit and grind of the Knicks is going to be what edges them out in this series. It's just like the same way that they said when OG got hurt, when Randall got hurt, when Mitch got hurt, they were just out there playing their hardest to try and win basketball games. And I think the MVP is going to be Josh Hart. I think that
Okay.
Josh Hart is the MVP of this series because I think if he can get a triple double the way that he was towards the end of the season, it doesn't even have to be a triple double. If he shows up and he's hustling and giving that, heart literally the way that we've seen in the second half, the post All-Star break, I think that's going to be a big advantage to the Knicks just because they're going to wear out the Sixers on the run and gun type of game. So I anticipate a fantastic series, and I think 5 is what I think it could be, but it would not shock me whatsoever if it was 6, even 7 games. I'd hate for it to go 7 because that's a brutal, taxing series on both teams,
Yeah.
and you don't want to go into another series against either Milwaukee or Indiana coming up. Like nobody wants a 7-game series first round,
Yeah.
but I do think this one wraps up in 5, and I think home court advantage is pretty big as well, just because obviously it's Madison Square Garden, and I know the Knicks fans are going to be showing up big time at Wells Fargo Center as well, because that's one thing about this Knicks team is we travel deep.
Yeah, and I got two more quick ones for you. Number
Hit me.
one, an X factor, and number two, some bold predictions. So I'll start with on the Sixers side of things. For me, the X factor, it's Kelly Oubre Jr. That I think he's going to be a guy that's going to open some eyes. His game has equated to winning in a way that I just don't think people recognize leading up to this year. And frankly, I'm a little impressed and surprised by myself. I think he's going to have some real flashes where he does lock down on Jalen Brunson for a couple stretches. I think offensively, he's very necessary to being that guy that steps up when the offense gets stagnant for periods, that he's valuable around Joel Embiid as a cutter, a guy that just provides a different threat to the
Yep.
defense. And I think he's going to be a guy that swings game for the Sixers team. So I'll throw him as my X factor. Who would you say is the guy on the Knicks?
I have Deuce McBride actually, and I've been thinking this for a little bit now, just because, like I said earlier, the non-Brunson minutes are going to be so important. And
Yeah.
Tibbs does love running both of them on the floor at the same time. But that full court press that Miles McBride provides, especially against a guard like Tyrese Maxey, who loves to just burst, right? He's so quick. One guy that on the roster that I think can hang with him in that sense is Deuce McBride. His defense is just he's on you like glue. He's a younger Kyle Lowry in a sense of he's going to be up on you. He's going to be pressing the whole time. And he had a great game against the Sixers in their last outing. And I think I'm kind of expecting somewhat of that same momentum to carry into this one, just because he was able to get hot from 3. He played his signature defense like we saw, and that's what led to winning basketball ultimately. So if there was an X factor, I think it's him. And the quiet guy in this is going to be Dante DiVincenzo.
Interesting. And I hate that I like all these guys. Like I've been a Deuce McBride guy since West Virginia. I love his
Right.
game as well. But I do have some news for you that Tyrese Maxey, you guys are going to be a little shocked by just how dangerous he can be getting downhill and how much that pace is. That Deuce is not hanging with that whatsoever. And that leads me to a couple bold predictions here.
Okay.
Number one,
Send it.
Tyrese Maxey will score 30 points 3 separate times in this series. That there will be 3 games in which Tyrese Maxey eclipses 30 points. I do think he's going to take the top off this Knicks defense for stretches and possibly even be the leading scorer. That I think we're going to see Joel Embiid be a little bit more of that complimentary playmaker, showing the well-roundedness of his game. And that brings me to my final 2 bold predictions here. Joel Embiid has at least 1 triple-double in this series, and Joel Embiid averages over 6 assists per game throughout the series as a whole. Those are my bold predictions and expectations.
I got to ask how you came to these conclusions even after last night. Were these already what, like, does last night almost not matter in a sense to you? Like, was that just like, listen, we just scraped by. We're kind of putting that out of our minds.
Uh, kind of, more or less. That was a survive and advance game. There's no doubt
Right.
about it. This is more of kind of a season long standpoint that I think like the 2-man game between Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid gives me a ton of optimism that I genuinely believe Tyrese Maxey is the best 2-man partner that Embiid has had. That includes Jimmy Butler, includes James Harden, includes Ben Simmons. And the reason that I say that specifically is there's so many more variations that they go off with Maxey and Embiid,
Right.
whether it is the dribble handoffs, whether it is the pick and roll, him coming off pin downs and the off ball motion that he does have, and just his ability to get downhill. That speed is such a unique skill set and one that there just isn't really a counter for, in my opinion. So I think Maxey's going to have his way. And for Joel specifically, some of it is due to the injury that he just doesn't have that ability to put a guy in the stanchion, put his shoulder down, and get in the post the way that he definitely does during points of the regular season. And I think a lot of it is just the offensive Nick Nurse, that there are the backdoor cutters. There is the guys creating shots off ball in a way that has not been the case for Joel. So I think his playmaking as a whole has been like a significant point of emphasis and something that I think translates in the postseason. I don't think Thibodeau is going to let the MVP of the league just beat them straight up in one-on-one coverage. And I think Embiid's capable of punishing them when they do send 2 and 3 with his playmaking. So more or less, this is a season-long kind of breakdown. And when thinking about how the matchups come, this is kind of how I landed on it.
All right. Fair enough. Fair enough. My key to the or not key to the game, somebody that I think can have kind of a storyline as well. I'm going to go ahead and say Bojan Bogdanovic. I think there is going to be a moment within this series where we're like, man, he just gave the Knicks a 9-point swing. You know,
Yeah.
it could be 3 3-pointers back to back to back. I think his catch and release is just so lethal. And that's somebody that, listen, he's solidified in the playoffs. We've seen it before that this guy can light it up, especially from deep come playoff time. So I think if he can tap into, what we saw from him in Utah a little bit, it could lead to some success for the Knicks down the road.
On Utah teams that perennially underperformed in the playoffs, I will point out for
That
the
is
record.
true. That
Yeah.
is true. But I'm pointing at Donovan Mitchell rather than anybody else on that roster for sure. Because
And Rudy
Donovan is
Gobert.
Gobert as well.
Yeah.
Donovan, a known underwhelmer come playoff time, just like I anticipate the Cavs losing to this Magic team in the first round.
Yeah, well, we will see what happens from here. I totally agree with you that this is going to be the best playoff series for sure in the Eastern Conference, possibly in the entire NBA. I will throw the Mavs, the Mavs
Mavs
first.
Clips is going to be a
Yeah,
war. Yep.
that's gonna be a fun one. Suns Timberwolves gonna be real fun as well. So the Western Conference, I think some juicier matchups out there. I do think this is absolutely gonna take the cake in the East, but we will see how it all goes down. So Matt, what else you got going on over at Mo Sports Network? Anything big throughout this playoff run, or anything else that you're working on? Apex Media as well.
Well, last season I was lucky enough to get given tickets. I told you and Nick I was given tickets to Game 3 of the Cavs, and I also was lucky enough. Shout out to Knicks Fan TV. I went out there to New York in Manhattan, and I was covering games one
Wow.
and 1, 4, whatever the 3 home games are that the Knicks had, aside from the one I saw. And
Okay.
I was able to go out there. I did pre and post game interviews. I got something posted by Bleacher Report, which is absolutely sick.
Sick.
So, it was a dream come true. And realistically, I'm just hoping to get back out to whether it's MSG or New York City in general. And we're going to replicate, hopefully, the same magic come first round, this weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe not all of that magic, I do think
Maybe just a little bit.
yeah, maybe not all of it. I do hope the end result is a little bit different for this specific series, but it's the beauty of sports and basketball is they got to
That's
check
it,
rock,
man.
play ball, and we'll see what happens. So make sure you're checking out all of Matt's work. You can check the links in the description to this video here. Follow everything that he's doing over at Mo Sports and all the other goodness he's got going on. Everyone also make sure you're liking and subscribing here. And then here comes what may be the biggest series of the Joel Embiid era. So appreciate all you guys for tuning in. Maybe that was a little much. We got deeper playoffs to worry about still. So, but regardless, thank you guys, and we'll talk soon.